I do have as you mentioned, I just have to state my conflicts of interest. I do have a couple of books on sugar. I have a number of patents and patent applications, and some have been licensed. All right, very good. Good morning. I think everyone is totally aware that we are in a massive epidemic that is worldwide and that involves both obesity and diabetes. And as you can see, obesity has increased dramatically over the last century. It has gone from about 3% of the adult population in the United States in 1900 to over 30 to 40% of the population today, more than a tenfold increase. Diabetes has increased even more dramatically. In 1900, Sir William Osler wrote that diabetes was prevalent in only 2 to 3 cases per 100,000 population, roughly 1 case per 50,000 people. There'd only be 20 people in Auckland who would have diabetes with the population today. That was in 1900. Today, more than 10 to 11% of the population of the U.S. is diabetic, and it's increasing. It's predicted that 1 in 3 children born today in the U.S. will develop diabetes. In some countries, diabetes is much higher. Among the Maori, 15 to 16% of the adult population are diabetic. Among Pacific Islanders, it's even higher. In Kuwait, diabetes affects 25% of the population. It's amazing. This is one of the most greatest epidemics of all time. This is creating heart disease. In 1900, angina was considered rare. In 1929, Sir William Platt, a very famous physician in the U.S., said for the first time heart disease is being seen by the family practitioner. In 1940, there were only 500 cardiologists in the U.S., or actually cardiology began as a discipline. In 1950, there were only 500 cardiologists in the U.S. Today, there's like 500 or over 100,000 coronary artery angiograms done yearly. There's like 300,000 surgeries. It's amazing what is going on worldwide. Hypertension affected less than 5% of the population in 1900 and now affects over 30%. More than 1 billion people in the world have high blood pressure. So these diseases are increasing at an enormous rate. And it's not just affecting adults. It used to say, well, we're living longer, so we're getting these problems. No, obesity, diabetes are being seen in children. Type 2 diabetes is now being seen in children. 1 in 6 children in the U.S. is obese. When you look at first graders, now 20% of first graders in Chile are obese. We have to figure out what's going on, and we have to figure out how to stop this epidemic. It is literally killing our population. As I mentioned, obesity is often associated with diabetes. The two run together in hypertension. What we now know is that many of these people develop a syndrome which is called the metabolic syndrome, in which lipids are elevated, like triglycerides, HDL cholesterol is depressed. Blood pressure tends to be high, and one of the key things is they have a pre-diabetic phenotype. They're developing insulin resistance. And this syndrome, which now affects 30 to 40% of our population in the US and probably the equivalent in the Pacific Islands or higher, this syndrome predisposes to the development of hypertension, which leads to stroke. It predisposes to chronic kidney disease. It predisposes to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, fatty liver, and cirrhosis. This is something we have to deal with. We're going to have to figure out what's driving this. Yes, coronary artery disease. You'll see people say, you know, heart disease is actually, cardiovascular mortality is going down. Yes, because we've got thrombolytics, we've got stents, we've got coronary artery surgery. We have all kinds of antihypertensives. We've learned how to treat the end point, but we haven't learned how to stop what's driving this whole process. And until we do, we have a public health crisis. Now, a lot of times you can figure out the causes of disease much easier when things are rare. When things are rare, epidemiology studies are really good at pinpointing causes. When things are extremely common, it's very hard to sort out what's causing what. back in the 1920s, a very famous doctor, Haven Emerson, New York City Health Commissioner, was alarmed at the increasing rate of diabetes, which had gone from 3 cases per 100,000 to 20 cases in a period of 20 years. A tenfold rise. Not very common back then, but it was alarming. And so he did one of the first epidemiologic studies in New York City where he looked very carefully what was tracking with the development of diabetes. And you know what he found? Among other things, he was the first one to show it was associated with being sedentary, with being over the age of 45, with a variety of characteristics that we know are associated with diabetes. But he linked it to sugar intake. And he proposed that sugar might be the cause of diabetes. He even contrasted what was going on there with New Zealand and Australia, where there wasn't as much diabetes at that time. And so he published his paper, and multiple other people agreed. In fact, Frederick Banting, the discoverer of insulin, the Nobel laureate, wrote a paper in 1925 suggesting that sugar might be the cause of diabetes and of this incredible epidemic that we're in. Others took similar stances. There was a paper in 1907, 8 different doctors from 8 different areas of the world made the case that the onset of diabetes in each population was associated with the introduction of sugar. Other groups, other authors wrote similar things, and including up to more recently. One of the great ones was by a guy named Cohen, who linked sugar intake with people living in Yemen who migrated to Israel. Their diets changed, and suddenly they were eating a lot more sugar, and there was a sudden increase in diabetes among them. There were others that wrote as well. There was some beautiful studies of these Indians that came into South Africa to work in the sugarcane fields and developed dramatic increased frequency of diabetes. And so this link with sugar and diabetes was reported quite early on, and it was actually one of the favorite theories for what was causing diabetes in the 1920s. And then what happened? I mean, why is it that this kind of got buried when there were so many people linking this relationship? And the crux was a guy named Ernest Joslin, a very famous doctor who started the Joslin Diabetes Clinic, one of the top diabetes clinics in the world. And Joslin said, you know what? I don't think it's sugar. I think it's overnutrition. He coined the word. I think it's too much food. People are eating too much, they're exercising too little, they're gaining weight, and that's causing diabetes. It's all driven by our culture. It's all driven by the large servings we're getting. It's driven by the fact that we now have cars and we're exercising less. And this belief took over. And by 1935, everybody was thinking it was overnutrition. And the fact is we're just eating too much. And we are eating too much. If you go to the US, they give you smorgasbords and refills, free refills. It's all there. We have internet, we have TV. I mean, the argument is convincing. But is it correct? We'll see. So as you say, you know, if you look at just a cross-section, we are eating more food. We are watching more TV. We are watching more internet. It is all about calories, isn't it? It's calories. It's the fact that it is our culture. And we're going to end up like WALL-E 20 years from now in the movie WALL-E. Remember, in the future, everybody's fat. The babies are fat. Everyone's on recliners. You're all getting food served. It's a problem of the advancement of civilization. We're meant to become fat. Or are we? The big breakthrough occurred in the mid-1990s when a scientist at the Rockefeller, Friedman, discovered that food intake is actually tightly regulated. There were actually studies that had shown this in animals well before that animals actually regulate weight carefully. A hibernating animal will purposely become fat in the fall. And migrating birds will suddenly decide, before they're going to migrate, they're going to get fat. Insects actually learn how to become fat before, when a cold weather comes in, they drop their metabolism and they store their fat. Animals have learned how to regulate their weight incredibly well, okay? And what regulates weight? Well, the big breakthrough was when Friedman discovered that there's a hormone that's released after you eat that says, hey, stop eating. Stop, it's time to stop, you're full. You don't need to eat anymore. That hormone is called leptin. And when he knocked out leptin, the mice would start eating so much, they just got fatter and fatter and fatter. That is from the cover of Nature magazine. That big guy on the right doesn't have any leptin. It's been knocked out of his system. He's twice as heavy as his two litter mates. I mean, he's heavier. Do you see that? That was leptin. So everyone said, aha, the problem is obesity must be due to a deficiency in leptin, but when they studied it, there was a problem with leptin, but we were resistant to leptin. People who become fat tend to become resistant to the effects of leptin. Why? The other thing that was discovered is that there's certain foods that actually cause a pleasure response in the brain. And when you eat foods, you get this dopamine response that tells you this is pleasure and you want to eat more. And there's a whole series of literature on this pathway. You're going to probably hear more about it. And it can lead actually to food addiction, because as you get more and more pleasure, you actually get this recurrent release of dopamine. And over time, that actually downregulates the receptor, so you have to eat more to get the same pleasure response. And there's now evidence that people with obesity show this kind of reduction in dopamine response similar to what you see with food addiction, with cocaine. In fact, they get the same signals, as you can see on the right here, where they get a decrease in this dopamine receptor. So there's something among obese people that's driving an addiction for foods or for certain foods. So now what we know is that the reason people are gaining weight, and studies have shown this, and it's actually true in hibernating animals too, is they turn on a biologic pathway where they become leptin resistant and they become what we call hyperphagic, which means that they eat a lot. And they start eating, and they drop their metabolic rate, and now we know that the metabolisms drop because people who are overweight have a defect in their ability to oxidize fat. So you actually start to accumulate the fat because you can't burn it as easily. Your energy falls. Your ATP, which is your marker of your energy, falls, and you can measure it in the muscle. You can measure it even in the peripheral blood. You can take white cells from people with obesity. They have lower ATP levels in some studies, in actually most studies, than controls. So the biology is driving the culture. The reason you're getting more plates of food is because you're more hungry. The reason that you are sitting and watching TV is primarily because you have low energy. It isn't the TV that's driving the effect. It isn't the large plates of food that's driving the effect. It's your biology is requiring you and asking you to get more food. So the equation's still true. The law of thermodynamics holds, but the problem is not overnutrition. Overnutrition is the response to the biology of what's going on. It's not culture driving obesity. It's biology driving culture. So what is activating this pathway? Why are we becoming leptin resistant? What is causing food addiction? And I'm going to revisit the role of sugar. So let's just go over what is sugar. Sugar, or a table sugar, sucrose, is a disaccharide of a molecule of glucose and a molecule of fructose bound together. There's a glucose molecule and there's a fructose molecule. It's 50-50, okay? Glucose is the main sugar in our blood that nourishes our tissues. Fructose is something our body doesn't really need, but it is in sugar, and it's very sweet. It's sweeter than glucose. Then there's also in the US a sweetener, an added sweetener called high fructose corn syrup, in which they mix fructose and glucose together, usually with a little bit more fructose than glucose, and often more than they tell you. And then fructose is in things that we know are healthy, like fruit. And so this causes a paradox, because we're going to show you that it's fructose is the problem. And so we'll talk about the paradox, the fruit paradox, later. Now, why am I concerned about fructose? Because it is a nutrient, which when we give it to an animal, they become leptin resistant, and they become addicted to it. Just like I told you, what drives the biologic process of obesity. What's more, they block animals fed fructose show a defect in oxidation of their fat, just like I explained in the biologic process that drives obesity. Fructose actually replicates and drives all the biologic processes that should lead to fat and to insulin resistance. This is a study where we put fructose in the drinking water for mice, laboratory mice. They love fructose. That's 10% or 15% fructose in the water, 30%. And when they get exposed to fructose, mice love it. They start drinking. They eat more. They don't suppress their appetite. They become leptin resistant. And guess what happens? They become fat. Even their energy levels fall. They actually become sluggish. We put little laser lights across the cages to see how active the mice were. They became sluggish, and with that, they became fat. In fact, we can show that fructose stimulates weight gain and obesity through these exact biologic processes. We even gave fructose to animals for a few months, made them leptin resistant, and we took the fructose away and we offered them high-fat diets, and suddenly they started eating so much of that, they gained weight very rapidly. I wish it was just the fact that sugar stimulates food intake, but it isn't. It isn't just that. Because we also did studies where we gave sugar or fructose to animals where we kept caloric intake normal. We did not allow them to increase their food intake. So even though they wanted to eat more, we didn't give it to them. We basically restricted what they wanted to eat, and we had them only eat exactly the same number of calories as their littermates who were eating a starch-based diet. And guess what happened? They still showed differences. After 3 or 4 months, these animals develop metabolic syndrome. They get elevated triglycerides. They get high blood pressure. They become insulin resistant. They don't gain weight because we got them on equal calories. So we could show that fructose has effects independent of excessive energy intake. It isn't just because you eat too much that you become diabetic. It's because you activate a biologic process that drives this risk. This is even scarier, okay? This is like really scary. We put these animals on a diet. They start eating 90% of what they normally should eat. But one gets a high starch diet, one gets a high sugar diet. After 4 or 5 months, the sugar-fed animals get fatty liver, and they became diabetic. That's scary. You can even get into trouble on a diet. And I wrote actually one of the first books on a low fructose diet, and I had a bodybuilder who she had not an ounce of fat, but she had elevated triglycerides, she had high blood pressure, she had fatty liver, terrible, and she was eating high carbs, high sugar diet to try to increase the energy before her performances. Even though it was very restricted, she was eating very little food. And that, when we took away the fruit, the sugar, and so forth, she had a dramatic response just to the diet. She didn't have to take an antihypertensive after we put her on the diet. And in fact, fructose drives all of these things that cause metabolic syndrome. Everything has been shown in the animal. It activates taste receptors in the brain. It makes animals absolutely addicted. It causes fatty liver. It causes inflammation. It causes all kinds of problems in the kidney. It causes insulin resistance. It's amazing, okay? There's a single nutrient that actually can induce all features of the metabolic syndrome. Every one, low HDL cholesterol. Show me another nutrient that just does that. This is a clinical study from Kim Stanhope. Kim and Peter Havel did a study where they gave adults 10 weeks. They got a high fructose diet or high glucose diet. High fructose diet increased total fat in the dark bar here, increased visceral fat. Glucose increased some fat, but it was more subcutaneous, kind of like the healthy fat. this group showed other effects. Fructose increased insulin resistance. Fructose increased postprandial triglycerides, triglycerides after a meal. It's proven, okay? It's not, all these people will say that fructose doesn't do things. It's proven. The proof is there. It's in animals, it's in people. The well-controlled studies show it, okay? Fructose is a cause of metabolic syndrome. You can't argue. And I look forward to anyone who wants to argue. This is a study we did in people in Menorca, Spain, where we gave fructose for 2 weeks. This is like a huge dose, okay? This is like drinking 6 20-ounce Cokes. Now, I would say that no one does this, but I heard from my friend Gerhard that some Tongans living here in New Zealand are drinking 1.5 liters at a time of soft drink, okay? So they're not way off. In 2 weeks, 25% developed the metabolic syndrome. This is something that's supposed to take decades. This is supposed to take decades to become obese and insulin resistant. We did it in 2 weeks. That is scary. They should never allow this kind of study again. Now, I'll tell you, we did put them on a low fructose diet afterwards, and every one of them had an improvement. So thank God we do not want to do this. But there are kids out there doing this experiment without IRB approval every day. There are children out there drinking large amounts of soft drinks. There are babies being given soft drinks in Australia among the minorities. And, we have to stop this. Now, one of the scary things that came up is that glucose can be converted to fructose in the body. And I believe that this is why carbs can be dangerous to people. It isn't just about sugar. Not that much gets converted, but some gets converted, and it depends on the individual. But we actually have shown that things like glucose can be converted into fructose. So carbs like bread and so forth may have a problem as well to a lesser extent than soft drinks. And we've been able to show that these get converted into fructose in the liver. And if you take mice that cannot metabolize fructose, you can actually give them carbs and you can block the development of fatty liver and you can block the insulin resistance. It's fructose, but most of the fructose that's causing our problems is coming from sugar, but there is some that can come from carbs, and identifying who's converting this and who's not is one of the goals of our research. The other thing is that carbs and sugar, it isn't just sugar. Sugar interacts with fat, and when you give sugar and fat together to animals, you toast the liver, you toast the body. The combination is horrid, but high fat alone doesn't do much. But when you add sugar, you get this terrible combination. And then if you block the fructose metabolism, you block everything. So it really looks like sugar is the major player, and it's interacting with the salty, with French fries and things like that. Okay. I'm going to skip this but there was a big paper that came out recently linking sugar intake with cardiovascular mortality, especially, and the sugar intake is significant. In the U.S., 15% of the total calories are coming from sugar. In some minority populations, it's as high as 17 to 20%. That is a lot of your diet consisting of sugar, 15, 20% of your diet is sugar. It should be 5 to 9% max. So let's just talk about this, so is there historical evidence that sugar plays a role in diabetes? And actually there is some interesting work from ancient Egypt where the apiaries, where they started making apiaries, which allows you to produce honey, and honey is a rich source of fructose, and by gosh, it was only afforded by the wealthy, and these pharaohs were eating it, and now you can do these really cool studies on these mummies, and you can show that these mummies were fat and so forth. And there is a relationship between being wealthy in the Old Kingdom and having fat. And one of the interesting things is that there's a marker for fructose intake. and that is cavities. Sugar causes cavities, and populations that don't eat sugar don't get cavities. And these ancient mummies actually started developing cavities, and there was like no bad teeth before them. You know, it's a really interesting thing. And then suddenly you see this obesity and bad teeth at the time when honey was becoming available. But the real entree was when sugarcane developed. And sugarcane first was developed in India, in the Ganges River Valley, and it was there that we see the first reports of obesity, of diabetes, and of angina. And in fact, the earliest reports were by an Indian doctor named Sushruta. Sugar then moved into Persia, it moved into China, it moved into Egypt. And by 800 AD, sugar was being really produced in Egypt, and they were seeing diabetes. There was a famous physician, Maimonides. He was originally in Spain. He saw no cases of diabetes. He moves to Egypt. He sees 25 cases in a year and a half. He goes, my God, what's going on down here? And it was, you know, it was interesting that sugar was being developed during that time there. Sugar then was brought into Venice, where it was basically so expensive only the kings could eat it, the very wealthy. And there are all these kings that became fat. King Charles the Fat, Sancho the Fat, Saxius the Fat, William the Conqueror, who was accused of being pregnant by King Philip I of France, and he declared war because of that. Louis VI became fat. King John, fat. St. Thomas Aquinas, not a king, but he became incredibly fat. Pope Fat Leo. King Henry, King Edward I, he got 1,800 pounds of sugar for his royal household in 1287. He loved it so much that he asked for 6,000 pounds of sugar for his household. Now, back in those days, 1 pound of sugar cost 28 pounds of cheese, or the cost of 34 dozen eggs. So the poor, the regular people couldn't afford sugar. It was just for the rich. St. Thomas Aquinas, he became so in love with sugar that he decided that you could eat it during the fast, and that it was a medicine. And he became extraordinarily fat. King Manuel of Portugal became so rich with sugar from the Sea Tome and all these little islands that they were making sugar from, that he decided that to show his wealth, he made statues, life-size statues of sugar of all the cardinals, sent it to the Vatican, where there's a pope there, Pope Leo, who absolutely loved sugar. He had these big orgy-like dinners and festivals, and he became incredibly fat, Pope Leo the Fat. And you know, we don't know if it was sugar, but he loved sugar. He also had a favorite little white elephant that he got from King Manuel as well. Christopher Columbus actually was the one who brought sugar to America. He actually went to the Canary Islands on his second trip. He met this beautiful woman named Beatrice de Bobadilla, and he was supposed to stay there in the Canary Islands for 3 days, but he stayed for more than a month. And she gave him some sugar cane cuttings to take to America, which he brought over. And what was born in love ended in hatred, because, as you know, the sugar cane plantations drove the slave trade. And slaves came over. 12.5 million Africans were brought over through the Middle Passage to work the sugar cane plantations. And the sugar was brought back to England, and as England controlled the seas, England began to get all the sugar, and they were the ones that put it in the tea. They were the ones that put it in the coffee. Suddenly you have sugar houses, and you have coffee houses. And the first sugar house was in England, like 1580. And Shakespeare starts to write about Falstaff, this big fat guy that developed gout who loved sugar. In fact, his nickname was Sack and Sugar because he loved to have sugared wines. And that was the name of a sugared wine. And sugar intake goes up in England. And sugar intake stays flat in France. And suddenly you see reports of obesity and diabetes and heart disease that occur in England. And you get reports like this from William Wadd: for every fat person in France, there's 100 in England. There was the other place where sugar was introduced was in Amsterdam. And in Holland, sugar came in from the Dutch East Indies, from Java. and Sumatra and places like this. And there was suddenly a dramatic increase in obesity and diabetes in Holland. I remember one story where there were some people that were so fat they had to cut out sections of the table so they could fit in, so they could reach and eat. It's true. Obesity, suddenly we get morbid obesity associated with these two countries. Daniel Lambert, a grocer, became so fat that 7 people could fit in his coat. And then sugar continues to increase, especially in England, but throughout Europe. And you start seeing this every decade, more and more sugar intake from 1700, where the average intake was 4 pounds a year, to 18 pounds a year, and 1800 to 90 pounds a year, to 155 pounds of sugar per person per year based on disappearance data. And you can see there were dips in the world wars, but sugar is taking over. Everyone loves sugar. I love sugar. We put it in everything that we can. If you add it a little bit to food, the high fructose corn syrup, you can make food taste great, right? But it's not doing us good. Because it relates to the rate of obesity. It relates to the rate of diabetes. Look at this relationship. It is tight. Look at the relationship to diabetes. It is tight. And what is the principal source of sugar? Soft drinks. Well, over 1/3 of sugar intake comes from soft drinks, and think about it, you drink it fast, you get the big bolus. In 1900, 11 drinks per year was the average sugar intake of soft drinks, 11 drinks a year. Up to 400 drinks per year by 1980, and it continues. This shows the percent of the total caloric intake. Up to 9% of all energy taken in, of all calories, is coming from sugar to the year 2000. From soft drinks. And it's affecting the Maori. It's affecting this population. It's affecting the Pacific Islanders. James Cook voyage in 1769, he talked about how the Maori were an athletic, limber, wonderful group of people where fat was not seen. People were not fat. Julien Marie Crozet, who was a Frenchman who had his own ship, said that the Maori had a partial love. They were partial for sugar. They really loved sugar. They didn't like salt. They didn't like alcohol. I like alcohol. I like salt. I like sugar. But the Maori liked sugar a lot. And by 1945, a diet survey showed that 15% of their overall energy calorie intake is from sugar. That's the percentage that's in the U.S. now. My guess is it's higher among the Maori now. Nauru is a great example. Nauru were the athletic Micronesian people. There was very little obesity. And 1909, phosphate-rich rock was discovered. Westerners came in and started mining. The natives got royalties, and they used the royalties to buy Western goods, and one of their favorite goods was sugar. Jared Diamond, the Pulitzer Prize winner, wrote that in 1925, there are some reports that some Nauruans were eating a pound of sugar a day. First case of diabetes in that country, 1927. Second case, 1931. Today, they have some of the highest diabetes rates in the world, some of the highest rates of obesity in the world. So I'm going to end by just, I've got to bring up this fructose paradox, this question of, okay, you've convinced me that fructose causes the metabolic syndrome, it causes diabetes, but what about fruit? Natural fruits are healthy, and they are. We actually did a study with low fructose diets with or without natural fruits in people for weight loss and improvement in metabolic syndrome, and actually the two were equal. In fact, the low fructose diet with natural fruit supplements actually did a little bit better. And the reason is, although it contains fructose, it's much less than soft drinks. And the other thing is that fruits contain so many good things, like vitamin C, antioxidants, flavonols, potassium, fiber, that they actually neutralize a lot of the effects. Natural fruits are good, okay? Now, fruit juices are a little bit more dangerous because now you take 3 or 4 fruit and now you got a higher dose of fructose and then you drink it real fast and that fructose bolus can actually overcome the good things in the fruit. Okay? So it's not so good to drink fruit juice. It's not so good to eat dried fruits, which we all loved, right? We love dried fruits. But they take out the nutrients as well and leave just the sugar. So I'm going to summarize. The storing of fat is a biologic process. Okay? It isn't about overnutrition. It causes overnutrition. The cultural response feeds into it, but it's not the principal driver. Sugar contains fructose, and it activates this biologic process. It doesn't mean it's the only bad guy out there, but it's the principal bad guy. Eating sugar increases body fat. We have a logo, sugar turns to fat. Okay? Eating sugar causes the metabolic syndrome. It's proven. It's not a debatable item. It increases the risk for diabetes, heart disease, liver, and kidney disease. Sugar intake has increased over the centuries. Intake is highest in the minority populations, and one of the major causes is soft drinks. And it is time for us to campaign against soft drinks. Okay, thank you very much.